Good morning, everyone, and thank you for joining us this morning. This is the third session in our speaker series to learn more about evolving concepts in service delivery for children and youth with support needs in BC. We're glad that you can be here with us this morning. I want to start by acknowledging that I'm joining you today from the unceded and traditional lands of the Coast Salish people, the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh nations. And I'm grateful to be able to live, work, play, and learn on these lands. I know that many of you are joining from other places this morning, and I'd invite you to offer your own land acknowledgement in the chat. So welcome. My name is Andrea Manchin. I am going to be one of your facilitators today. I'm from Argyle. We are an engagement firm, and you'll see a number of my colleagues here today with our blue backgrounds. So our role is to help facilitate a discussion later on in the session. And also joining us today, we have a number of staff from the Ministry of Children and Family Development who will be supporting as note takers in our breakout rooms, but who are also here to listen and learn alongside with you today. I want to go through just a few measures that we have in place today to support a successful session. So we're asking folks to stay on mute during the presentation. And then when we come into our breakout discussions and you want to share some thoughts and reflections, we can come off mute at that time. We have closed captioning available. So if you'd like to enable that, you can click the CC button in your Zoom toolbar. We also have a technical moderator as part of our team today. Taruni is here to support you with any technical questions or challenges that you might be having. So if you need support in that way, please message Taruni. She has her name labeled as technical moderator, so you'll be able to find her in the participant list and in the chat. We're going to be using a few polling questions as part of the session today. So in just a minute, you'll see a pop-up window with the polling question, and you'll be able to click into that poll and provide your response when that pops up. We also have ASL interpretation as part of the session. So we've spotlighted our ASL interpreter, so they will be visible at all times, as will our presenters. You can also customize your view. So if you only want to see the ASL interpreter or only want to see the presenter, you can just pin that person as part of your Zoom display. When we do move into the breakout rooms, I'll just ask if anyone would like that ASL interpretation, please to message Taruni, our technical moderator, and we'll make sure that the ASL interpreters come into the breakout room with you. We're going to be recording the presentation this morning, and that will be shared online afterwards. So if you want to come back to some of the content that was presented, and as well for others that were not able to attend today, it will be made available. The discussion portion of the session won't be recorded. And that's really so that we can, be mindful of everyone's privacy and support a very open and candid conversation. So on that note of privacy, anything that you do share within the session today is being gathered anonymously, and your responses would be confidential. Any input that you do share could be used to inform a new provincial service approach for children and youth with support needs, or potentially other future government programs and services. The information is being collected under Section 26C and 26E of the Freedom of Information and Protection of Privacy Act. And if you have any questions about that, there is an email on the screen that you're welcome to pose those questions to, and we'll put that email in the chat as well so that it's accessible to you throughout the session. I'd like to just touch on a couple of notes around a respectful conversation and making sure that everyone is supported in that way. We're asking everyone to be mindful and respectful of each person's opinions and personal experiences, and of each other's privacy. So when we're in our breakout rooms, please be conscious of that, and also conscious of sharing the floor. So this idea of being mindful of, giving space to other folks to share. We won't tolerate any disrespectful behavior towards a fellow participant, a facilitator, or a staff member. And then lastly, this concept of stepping back or stepping up, and it kind of speaks to that notion around sharing the floor. So if you find that you're a person that generally participates very openly in discussions, we welcome that. We want that this morning. We also hope that you'll be able to give space to others to share and maybe step back at times. And then for those that tend to be a little bit quieter, maybe you're coming here just to listen and learn, really want to encourage you and hope that you feel welcome and safe to share your views and perspectives as well. So to step up into the conversation. And then lastly, we recognize that today's conversation might be difficult for some. We're speaking about our children and youth, and those personal experiences may be difficult to share. So please just be welcome to look after yourself in whatever way makes the most sense. That might mean turning your video off at times or stepping away. You're certainly welcome to do that. We also do have a social support person on the call with us today. So if you feel that you need some additional support, a person to talk to separately, please message to Rooney, our technical moderator, and she will connect you with Jay, our social support person, in a separate breakout room. There might be someone else in there, so it wouldn't necessarily be a one-on-one conversation, but we want you to know that that is available if you need it. Okay, so our agenda for the session this morning, I'm going to share a brief overview of the engagement that's underway through the ministry around informing that new service delivery approach for children and youth with support needs. And this speaker series is one part of that overall engagement. Then we will move to the presentation, the reason that we've gathered here today. So we'll have our presentation from Dr. Rachelle Hull and Dr. Tim Stainton around individualized funding. We will take a break after their presentation, and then we'll come back and have time for a bit of a Q&A with Dr. Hull and Dr. Stainton. So when you have questions during their presentation, we're asking you to please put those into the chat, and that will allow us to sort of moderate and sort through those questions and share the most common ones during that Q&A period. So if you see a question that's resonating with you, a question that you also had on your mind, you can use the thumbs up to like that question in the chat thread, and that will help us sort of understand where those most common questions are. And then following that Q&A, we'll move into the breakout discussions that I referenced. So within each breakout room, you will have a facilitator from my team with our blue backgrounds, and you will have a note taker from the ministry there to capture the feedback and any input that you share. After the breakout discussion, we'll come back together as a full group, and we'll just have a short report back where we'll ask a couple of our facilitators to share some of the conversation that took place in those breakout rooms, so we can get a sense of what the conversation was like elsewhere in the session. And then we'll close with just some notes around how to continue to engage in this overall work, and a little bit of a note on the remaining sessions in the speaker series. So we'd like to just do a little bit of a warm up with you now and start us off with a couple of polling questions. So the first one is going to pop up shortly for you, and just to get a sense of where folks are joining us from today. So if you can take a moment to respond to that poll, and then we can share those results. Okay. So we've got most responses in, and I can see that about 42% of us roughly are joining from the Greater Vancouver, Fraser Valley, Sunshine Coast, Sea to Sky, and Lillooet area, followed by the Vancouver Island and Coast and the Thompson Okanagan as a couple of the other regions where you have a number of folks joining. Also great to see folks from the Northeast, the Cariboo and Kootenay, and the North Coast. So thank you for sharing that. And then our next polling question is just to get a sense of the perspectives that might be in the room with us this morning. So thinking about the perspective that best represents you. You can choose more than one. So you might be a family that's currently accessing services, or a family with a child or youth with support needs that's not currently accessing services. You might be a youth yourself, a healthcare professional, either providing direct care or indirect care, policymaker or researcher with a nonprofit organization, an educator, and then we also have an option for other, if none of those selections quite fit, and you're welcome to add in the chat if you would like the perspective that you're bringing into the conversation today. So seeing lots of responses here, a little over half of us have responded to the poll so far. Okay, and I can see then fairly even between families who are accessing services and the healthcare professionals providing those services. Also some professionals providing indirect care, a number of nonprofits, educators. So really we've got representation in all of these groups, which is great to see. And hopefully we'll make for a really rich discussion when we come to our discussion groups. All right, so I'll provide just a quick overview of the engagement. As I mentioned, this speaker series is part of a broader engagement that is underway to help inform service delivery approach for children and youth with support needs in BC. At the end of the session, we'll share some ways with you that you can continue to engage in that work. The speaker series in particular is an opportunity to hear from professionals about topics related to children and youth with support needs. And it's also an opportunity to collaborate and share between us as part of that work to inform that new service approach. So we're hoping to hear from families, professionals, service providers, and others to have an inclusive conversation, share the latest research and insights around best practices, and really to help inform an approach for children and youth with support needs that's balanced with local situations and individual needs. And so without further delay, we're very pleased to welcome this morning Dr. Rachelle Hole and Dr. Tim Stainton, who will be presenting on the topic of individualized funding. Dr. Rachelle Hole is a professor in the UBC Okanagan School of Social Work and co-director of the UBC Canadian Institute for Inclusion and Citizenship. She's also a Tier 1 UBC Principals Research Chair in Critical Disability Studies. She's committed to community-engaged research that is informed by the principles of disability justice, and her research seeks to inform policy and practice that fosters the well-being and inclusion of individuals with disabilities and their families. Dr. Tim Stainton is professor at the School of Social Work and co-director of the Canadian Institute for Inclusion and Citizenship at the University of British Columbia. He holds a PhD from the London School of Economics on disability rights and social policy. Prior to his academic career, he worked on deinstitutionalization of people with disabilities in British Columbia and as head of policy and programs for the then Ontario Association for Community Living. He's consulted nationally and internationally on issues of system change and has published widely on disability rights, individualized funding and self-directed supports, service delivery, history, and ethics. Tim is a fellow of the International Association for the Scientific Study of Intellectual Disability. He was a member of the Transition Steering Committee and the Interim Board of Community Living BC. So please welcome Dr. Stainton and Dr. Hole, and I will turn it over to the both of you. We're not going to a break yet. Sorry about that. Turn it over to the two of you for your presentation.
Thank you, Andrea. I'm just going to share my screen here. Can you see that?
Yes, we can. Thank you.
Perfect. Well, thank you for the opportunity and the invitation to be part of the speaker series. It's a real privilege to be here today. As Andrea said, Tim and I are going to be speaking about individualized funding. Particularly, we're But before we begin, we would like to personally acknowledge that today we're joining from the unceded traditional and ancestral territories. For myself, I'm joining from the territories of the Syilx people in the Okanagan, and Tim is joining from the unceded territories of the Tsawwassen Nation. So today we just wanted to start by clarifying that what we're really going to be focusing on is the findings of a review of the international literature with a specific lens around individualized funding for families with children and youth with support needs. So just in terms of where we're going today with our presentation, we're going to provide you with the definition of individualized funding, a brief overview of what we did, and then an overview of the findings. And particularly, we're going to focus on the barriers and facilitators of individualized funding. What are the policy findings in the research literature? And the so what? What are the implications of what we found? So that's where we're headed. So individualized funding is funding that's allocated directly to an individual, or in the case of a child, their parents or legal guardian, to provide the support necessary to meet disability-related needs. Individualized funding has two fundamental characteristics. First, the amount of funding is determined by direct reference to the individual's and/or family's specific needs and aspirations. And second, the individual and/or the family determine how funds are used to meet those needs that are eligible for funding. So just a couple qualifications here with respect to that definition. There's wide variation and wide usages of individualized funding across the international jurisdictions. And currently in BC, for children and youth, direct payments or individualized funding is not needs-based. So what did we do? We conducted a scoping review of the international literature, specifically looking at what are the barriers and facilitators with respect to individualized funding models, and what are the implications and operational considerations of IF, or individualized funding. So our search yielded, yes, 4,523 research articles that we screened. Our research team screened with us. And 58 of those met the inclusion criteria that specifically focused on families with children and youth with support needs. Just as a clarification, we didn't look necessarily at adults for the purposes of today's presentation. And when you do look at individualized funding models, more typically across the international jurisdictions, you see individualized funding being used for adult services. And so we just want to clarify that this is really about focusing on families with children and youth with support needs. Looking at the 58 articles that are included in the literature review, the majority of them are from Australia, which isn't surprising given the National Insurance Disability Scheme that was implemented in Australia. 14 were from the UK, 2 from Europe, 1 from New Zealand, 4 from the United States, and 1 had an international focus. So just in terms of thinking about the benefits of individualized funding, it's really based on the notion of self-direction and self-determination. So it was a movement away from kind of a medical focus around disability supports and a shift towards person-centered, or what we're seeing increasingly in the literature, a focus on a family-centered approach to supports and services. So at the center of individualized funding is the notion of self-determination, and underpinning values and principles of individualized funding are increased senses of control, increased choice, reliability, and flexibility of access to supports and services. Specifically, when it comes to children, for families with children and youth, in the literature, there's a focus on greater access to choice of therapy providers specifically. So in the box below here, there's a list of some of the common facilitators and how they contribute to positive experiences. And I won't go through that because I'll unpack those in the following slides. So some of the key facilitators that were identified in the research were issues around clear lines of communication. With respect to communication, families repeatedly, and the research repeatedly showed that in order for individualized funding to be successful for families, that families needed timely, accessible, and clear information. There was a value placed on expertise and information sharing, and this was specifically important and emphasized when it came to early childhood interventions. So not surprisingly, when families first learn that their child has a disability or particular support needs, early on in that journey, having valuable expertise and having clear communication about how to access supports and services was emphasized repeatedly in the literature. Interestingly, family status, social capital, capacity, and geographic location were also facilitators of successful individualized funding. So when we looked at the experiences of families with children and youth with support needs, positive experiences of individualized funding were highly correlated with socioeconomic advantage. So more privileged families were able to more easily access and have successful experiences when it came to self-directed supports. The other interesting thing, and this gets back to my comment around person-centered and increasingly seeing family-centered, the research shows that having supportive family and community relations also facilitated positive experiences with individualized funding. Not surprising, the role of a trusted service provider or some kind of navigator when it came to individualized funding was really important for families. Oftentimes when you're looking at making choices and making self-directed decisions around supports and services, knowing that you have someone to speak to consult with around those choices and options really enhanced the outcomes for families and for their children and youth. And this was particularly important. Again, this repeated throughout much of the research that when it came to early childhood intervention supports, that having that trusted person or navigator help people make decisions really impacted the outcomes in terms of the quality of choices and the supports that they received. The idea of interagency and intersectoral collaboration came up over and over again so that families could see that their supports were coordinated and not siloed. And not surprised. So those were the facilitators for individualized funding. And for many of them, again, it's kind of the other side of the coin, if we flip the coin. So when we were talking about a facilitator of positive experiences of individualized funding being access to clear and effective communication, repeatedly the research talked about lack of access to information being a barrier to families getting the supports and services that they needed. Particularly, there was a lot of discussion in the Australian context of families being frustrated with the application and the assessment process in order to be able to qualify for individualized funding. So ensuring that there's a clear and accessible and process in terms of applying for and receiving individualized funding is really important. And some of the research spoke about when families were trying to navigate the system on their own. Sometimes they would get contradictory advice from professionals, which would be problematic in terms of them making decisions about individualized funding, which ultimately would have a negative impact on their family's well-being and experience. One of the big barriers that's spoken about repeatedly in the research is the administrative burden that families experience when it comes to individualized funding models. So the researchers talk about the burden and sometimes the unequal capacity to take on self-management. And that unequal capacity isn't necessarily related to individual parents' capacities, but also to contextual factors that their families face. So that administrative burden is a serious consideration when we're thinking about the diversity of families who have children and youth with support needs. And oftentimes the administrative burden can lead to restricted choice and control that impacts the family and child well-being. One of the repeated areas that came up around families' journeys of accessing individualized funding was the idea of age-based transitions. So we know that families, transition times for families can be stressful for any family, and this really plays itself out in the research literature. And specifically, one of the key kind of stress points that the research emphasized was the transition from youth to adult services, and that this was a really difficult time for families when it came to navigating individualized funding and making choices around services and supports for their youth. The research talks about how the transition from an education system where there tends to be more structured support for families, that it's provided through education structures, to the adults individualized funding models where it's lacks that kind of structure, caused a lot of stress for families. And so these are key considerations as families try and make are transitioning to different kinds of supports and having to make new choices around supports and services with individualized funding. The other piece that repeatedly came up was the problem of having siloed structures. So researchers spoke about the separation and the siloing between education, the healthcare system, and the social care system, and spoke about how families are interacting with multiple systems. In the BC context, it would be multiple ministries. And so trying to navigate making decisions around individualized funding within those siloed systems was very frustrating for families and impacted the ease or impacted the difficulties they had in making self-directed decisions around the services and supports they received. Another barrier really, and this is emphasized previously, but the idea that there are socioeconomic barriers associated with individualized funding. So when we spoke about one of the facilitators was that families that were of higher socioeconomic statuses tended to have better outcomes when it came to individualized funding. The lack of resources and capacity presents real challenges to family in terms of individualized funding models. One very specific examples were if families, for example, needed to pay up front for services and supports and then get reimbursed, that often could cause financial hardship for families. And we also recognize, and the research emphasizes, that individualized funding operates within existing social and cultural disparities. So the research shows how it can actually compound the alienation of equity deserving groups and how they experience marginalization, and also those with more complex support needs. So IF is complicated by the fact that there exists those disparities among and across families already. So, and then 4 studies explicitly recognize the compounded marginalization of people with Indigenous and culturally and linguistically diverse families when it comes to accessing individualized funding. And then finally, the research speaks to the disparities in terms of rural and remote constraints. So families who live in rural and remote areas, their experiences of individualized funding are also can be negatively affected. And this is due to lack of information and advice, limited local service options and capacities, higher costs and fewer services, and the complexity of self-managing packages where some of those services are limited. Some of the research spoke about how families in rural and remote settings, because there were fewer services for them to access, they sometimes had to rely on adult services, which weren't necessarily meeting the needs of their children or youth with support needs. So those limited kinds of supports and services had an impact in terms of people's ability to access and effectively use self-directed supports in rural settings. And then related to that, in rural and remote settings, there was a strain in terms of the availability of professional and skilled staff. This was actually seen in Australia across all of Australia, across the provinces and territories, but it was particularly highlighted or intensified when it came to families living in rural and remote settings. So those are some of the facilitators and barriers that we identified in the research that the research spoke about. And now I'm going to throw it over to Tim to talk about, well, what are some of the policy and practice implications, and what's the so what of all of this?
My headset will only stay connected to one or the other.
I'm getting some other input. Okay, that's great. Thanks very much, Rachelle. And good morning, everybody. I should have said in my bio that I have another set of expertise I bring to this. I have a son with support needs, and he was formerly on the at-home program and is currently receiving IF through Community Living British Columbia. So I kind of bring that lens a little bit to this as well. So I'm going to talk a bit about what we saw in the lit review, and then open it up a bit more to think about a little more what we might do with this in the British Columbia context. But a couple of caveats at the beginning, that there is a really wide variation in how IF is used and implemented across the jurisdiction. So as Rachelle mentioned, Australia converted their entire disability support system, cross disability groups, cross age groups, to an individualized funding system. The UK has had what they call a direct payment system for a number of years, and various Canadian provinces have some versions of this, and in the US we have a whole set of different states implementing this. But it's really important to looking at the research stuff of not simply adopting directly from other jurisdictions, because they are quite different culturally, structurally. The jurisdictional responsibilities are different in different countries. So we just need to be cautious about if we read something in the literature and saying, oh, we can do that here, because it's usually not that simple. IF is most commonly used by adults internationally, and most commonly by people with physical disabilities and intellectual disabilities. Mental health would probably be third, and as well as by older persons. There's quite an extensive program in the US for older people without disabilities. For children and youth, it's less common, and it tends to be more focused in its use. So things like respite and therapy, which is kind of the usage we see here in BC. For adults, it tends to open up much more broadly. So people use it to support their residential supports, as well as day supports, employment, educational engagement. So a much bigger variety and more comprehensive set of usages in the adult sector. Okay, we can go to next slide. So in our findings through this lit review, as Rachelle mentioned, there's a real need to integrate our systems, you know, between the healthcare and social care and the education systems. We see a lot more of that in the UK than we do in other jurisdictions. Rachelle also mentioned that really it needs to be. Hello.
Hey, Janet. Good. How are you?
Sorry, somebody's having a conversation.
We'll take care of that. Sorry about that, Tim.
The importance of a strong community relationship, all of that is just generally good practice, and that doesn't change with individualized funding. And as Rachelle mentioned, that we need to really account for the different political and economic contexts, and we mean that both intra and interjurisdictionally. So some areas have less access to workers, some areas it's more expensive, some areas you have real transport challenges. So all of that needs to be taken into account. Okay. Really, any individualized funding system works best in the context of a real person-centered or family-centered planning system. So it's one piece of a broader puzzle. And really, to make that happen effectively, having access to facilitators or case managers or navigators to help you walk through that is a really critical piece to the whole puzzle. Again, in the barriers, we noted the communication issues, and I won't go through all of these, but in study, I believe out of Australia, Tracy identified a number of key factors which make for good communication and information transfer for people. Okay. Again, we saw this transition from child and youth to adult supports. You know, historically, we call this the falling off the cliff moment when you go from the children's system to an adult system. We briefly had a more integrated system in BC. Some of you may recall that in the first couple of years of CLBC, children's services were within that. And the intention of that was to smooth this transition. So in any system we want to consider, we want to make sure that it makes the transition as easy and less frightening for families and the individuals involved. You know, ensuring that there's flexibility in the system. Some individualized funding systems are individualized, but really are highly constrained in what you can do with the fund, and some of that is necessary to keep within the mandate. But ensuring we maximize the flexibilities that individuals and families have, which is really the whole point of individualized funding. Clear and transparent eligibility and funding level determination processes. This really applies when the more open individualized funding systems like we see in Australia, or to some degree the adult CLBC system here, and the UK. If you're going to try to target funding to specific individualized needs, you're going to get variation. So you need to make sure that the reasons why family X gets this amount and family Y gets this amount are clear and transparent and defensible. Another thing we hear about is the reporting requirements. Some individualized funding systems have fairly onerous reporting systems. So the monthly financial reports, auditing systems. And well, from a system perspective, they're seen as a safeguard. From a family perspective, they just kind of add to the burden of usually already overstretched and overstressed families. Okay. As Rachelle mentioned, that a lot of the studies note that IF works best when there's a strong administrative support behind that. And that's really things like assistance with finding employees, assistance with being an employer, with the employee or employer responsibilities, tax, payroll administration. And we're actually seeing some very sophisticated models of this around the world. New Zealand particularly has developed some very easy to use comprehensive models of we call it the backbone support for IF. And from what we've seen there, families find IF much easier to use and much less burdensome. So that administrative piece is really key if you're going to go to a bigger IF system. This came up in the literature, but I think it's certainly an issue for us in BC that if you're in a more remote area and you're getting some form of individualized funding, but for you, it means you have to drive 60, 100 miles to the therapy or to the session. That cost really ramps up, and that tends to fall on the family rather than being part of the budget. So ideally, you want to make sure that we add in those kind of travel costs, particularly for rural and remote users, where again, that can just add to families' burdens. There is some indication, both the literature and in sort of what I've observed around the world, that IF can potentially undermine shared or collective services. So again, in structuring any IF system, you need to be cautious you're not inadvertently undercutting valuable services and service providers. And again, Australia is where most of that is coming from, and some very good, more interesting, more the softer family support advocacy services have struggled under the new NDIS system, and we've seen some very good ones disappear, which is somewhat worrying. Okay, so let's just talk a little more openly about IF and some of the things you might want to think about for British Columbia. So there's no question that IF can be used for a broad range of supports for families and children, everything from child development, healthcare, therapy, respite, as well as direct payments to carers to support them in their caring duty. As I mentioned, the infrastructure piece is what usually gets lost, and what usually means the difference between a system that works well for families and a system that actually adds to their burdens. Obviously, this depends on the scope of the IF system, but we need a strong system of planning support for those families. We need some system to help them recruit and find workers or professionals or therapists, and the whole employee and funding administration, because it's quite complicated, and if you mess it up, it can also be quite expensive. So in most cases, and in my view, that IF won't and shouldn't replace all of the agency and collective services, and often existing agencies actually work very well with IF systems, so families can purchase from the agency directly, or have some combination of directly funded supports and agency-based supports. So we need to think about what that looks like in terms of how we want to structure it. So some systems don't allow you to use an agency with your direct funding. Some systems allow the agency to manage the funding for you, but you make the decisions on how it's used. And some systems will allow you to mix and match. So I'll use an agency for this support, and I'll use my IF directly for this support. Okay, go to the next one. We talked a lot about rural and remote communities, and it's one of the useful things about the avalanche of Australian literature is Australia lines up pretty well with Canada and BC in terms of the balance of rural and urban communities. And IF does present some unique challenges, but also some opportunities for rural and remote community, and similarly for Indigenous and other cultural communities. So as Rachelle mentioned, on the upside, if you have a poorly supported IF system, that can add to the challenges families who may already be struggling with other socioeconomic issues. And now we're going to ask them also to manage all this funds and find. On the other hand, it can free up resources in those rural and remote communities. If you don't need to use an agency, you don't need to go to another place. You can be empowered to hire aunties and uncles, friends, community members to provide respite and those kind of support. So it actually can be an advantage in terms of both workforce, but also cultural competence. So you can hire people from your own community, from your own cultural background that understands more about your life and your world and your family. So it's a bit of a mixed bag, but if done well, it does open up some possibilities for addressing some of these long-standing concerns around serving more rural, remote, as well as Indigenous and other cultural communities. Generally, if it's done well, IF is both cost-effective and has positive outcomes for the child and the family. And what we mean by that in the literature, again, it's hard to translate because the cost depends on the system and how many pieces and how well supported it is. But generally, I think the research doesn't suggest necessarily that IF is cheaper, but on a cost-benefit basis, you get better bang for your buck from an individualized system than you do from a collective system. And again, when done well, and this is the adults of the child system, people do feel more empowered, they feel more in control, that they're able to more effectively support their son or daughter, because they have control on who, why, and when. They can change and adapt to their family situation. Okay, so just some last comments. One of the puzzling things about the Australian system, which now has over 600,000 users, is you need to be cautious about a purely market-driven approach. So they went with what they call an open market. So you get the money and you hire and fire, and in most cases, the people you're hiring are independent contractors, or sometimes through an agency. That kind of created a couple of problems. There was a scarcity, but also it created a systems problem in that many of the professionals and therapists, once you had a government program in place to pay for this, they popped up everywhere, and their rates have gone significantly. I was in Australia last year, and I heard stories of a behavior therapist charging $1,600 for a 90-minute session. So we need to be cautious how much you want to open this up to a pure market system. There can be challenges for agencies if they're purely relying on IF. So if all of the revenue is coming from direct contracts with individuals and families, but there's ways around that, adding administration fees, but also providing some baseline infrastructure funding to agencies so that they can maintain the continuity of service. So really to sum up, that IF can be a useful and empowering tool if done well, but if not, it can also add to families' challenges. So we need to be really careful how we do it. And lastly, that IF is likely and shouldn't really replace our collective or agency-based services. So finding the right balance, figuring out what things work better one way or one place. But at this point, and particularly for the children and family side, I don't think the evidence supports moving away from a collective or an agency-based service. Okay, and I think that's the last one. Yes, so thank you very much.
Thank you both, Dr. Rachelle Hull and Dr. Tim Stainton. We appreciate that presentation. We are going to take a quick break. So I'm going to move us into break till about 11. And then we can come back and we'll do, we have a couple of questions that have come through the chat for the two of you based on the research that you've shared with us today. So feel free to turn your screens off for a moment and we'll re-adjourn at 11. Thank you. All right, welcome back, everybody. Hope that was a restful break. We have a few questions now for you both, Rachelle and Tim, based on some of the conversation that's taking place in the chat. So maybe I'll start us off. There's a question around whether any of the reviews or any of the literature included hybrid models where there was choice between individualized funding or system-led services. Could you speak to that?
You want to speak to that, Tim, or I'll go first and you can add afterwards? Okay. So with respect to the literature that we looked at, specifically focused on families with children and youth with support needs, there was discussion about hybrid models, and the research seemed to show that families had a more positive experience when there was a combination of both in the literature. Tim, do you want to add to that?
Yeah, just like looking at other jurisdictions, several do have hybrid models, and I think families do appreciate having the choice and the option.
I think in terms of the research that we looked at, families appreciated the reduced administrative burden, which we see as both one of the facilitators and one of the barriers to families' experiences. So, but then also having the hybrid, as Tim said, it still offers some of that, the choice and the self-direction. So I think balancing kind of the benefits of not having the sole administrative responsibility of individualized funding, but then also still maintaining some ability in terms of self-direction and choice when it comes to supports and services was a benefit.
Okay, thank you. Another question, did the research note which system or department oversaw the distribution of individualized funding and whether that had any impact in any way based on maybe the mandate of that system or department? For example, the MCFD might have a child protection lens versus a medical lens through the Ministry of Health. Can you speak to that, if that showed up at all in the research?
Tim, yeah.
I'm not sure we saw a lot of discussion of that in the research, because in most cases they were looking at their system, right? So in Australia, it's a national, almost like a crown corporation agency that is national. In the UK, it's national legislation, but local administration, so the equivalent to municipal. The UK is probably the one that's integrated best with health, though, and other systems. But yeah, I don't recall seeing anything specifically about kind of the culture issue in terms of the culture of the overseeing agency. I don't know of any off the top of my head that are still under health, other than kind of our adult health support services for physical disabilities are still under health. So.
Okay, thank you. There's also a couple of questions around accountability measures or regulations that would maybe mitigate some of the risks with individualized funding. So for example, was there anything that you saw around caps for what service providers could charge to mitigate potential price increases or price gouging or the offering of unregulated services, for example?
Will you take that?
Yeah.
Yeah, the capping of prices, I mean, it's done differently and could be done differently. I think for Australia, they're actually now looking at bringing in caps because they didn't, and it's problematic for the system. But you could also work with the colleges of the various professions. You could put in, certainly for children and therapy, I think you would want regulations about the qualifications of people you're allowed to retain to provide support. But all of that's pretty easy to do in regulation. But as they saw in Australia, when they didn't do that, it was problematic.
Okay. There's also been a couple of questions around reimbursement for services. So you had mentioned that could be a barrier for families having to pay upfront for services. Was there anything that talked about sort of the timeliness or how like what would be the optimal time frame for reimbursement and whether there were any impacts to a family's debt level and how that might change?
Yeah, so when I was referring to that particular barrier, it was really talking about those situations when families had to pay upfront, and then so in terms of timely reimbursement, a lot of that would then depend upon them managing the administrative responsibilities to invoice for those services or supports that they paid for upfront. And clearly, depending on the family's socioeconomic status or how much money they make, there would be an unequitable impact for people with lower socioeconomic status, because it would be more of a financial burden and financial hardship. And then they also have to take on that administrative responsibility to ensure that they're submitting the invoices. So they didn't really talk about on the other side the administrative response, but most corporations or governing bodies would have a time limit in terms of how they would have to respond to that. But it was clearly for folks that were more financially strapped, that would be a much higher negative impact for them.
And it's fairly uncommon, to be honest, that most of the systems you get a monthly check and in advance that you then use for your services. New Zealand's kind of interesting that those kind of backbone agencies, administrative support agencies, they actually pay the providers and they bill the government. So that takes the strain off of families. I think what we see a little more commonly is where families underspend, and so the paying back of unspent funds and stuff can be a bit problematic. But it's relatively rare in a true IF system for families or users to actually have to pay up front and bill back.
And maybe just to follow up on that, were there any examples in your review where the individualized funding was adjusted for cost of living increases?
I'm not aware of any. I think Tim, correct me if I'm mistaken here, but because the funding goes to disability related needs, it's really tied to the costs and the assessment of what supports and needs are needed for the children and youth or the family, as opposed to kind of a cost of living subsidy.
Yeah, I think that's right. And it's, I mean, it's a really good question, actually, that I've never thought a whole lot about. But I think, as Rachelle said, I think the bigger issue is making sure the individualized funding is sufficient to pay what the going rate for a therapist or whoever they're accessing, and that kind of keeps up. But it's a good question. I don't have a really detailed answer, I'm afraid.
That's a takeaway, I think. Yeah. Okay. And then just around, you talked a bit about some of the barriers remote or rural families might experience individualized funding a little bit more differently. And you also talked about cultural differences and language differences. Can you speak to, how those show up in terms of families that maybe have chosen individualized funding, but are in maybe one of those groups or both? And if the literature revealed anything about how to maybe address some of those barriers?
Well, I'll go first on this one. It depends kind of on the system, and the literature was varied, I think, for different systems. Proactively, I think the benefit there is that being able to hire someone who speaks the language that's spoken in your home, right? Those kind of things that are really important. I might just reference another piece of research Rachelle and I did around respite services, and some of our Indigenous participants spoke about, it would be great if I could hire an auntie, right? Because they know us, they know things, and the system made that kind of difficult in terms of hiring relatives and that sort of stuff. So we certainly heard about that in a previous study we did. I don't know if that answers the question, but I'll let Rachelle actually answer the question.
Could you ask it again, Andrea?
Yeah, the question was around how families that choose that have individualized funding, if they're in rural or remote communities, or if they have language or cultural differences, like how they experience individualized funding, and what might make that experience better.
Okay. Yeah, I think Tim's comment about, being able to hire a worker who is culturally safe. I think that's a really key piece in terms of a benefit. I think what kept on coming up in terms of the research literature was really a focus on some of the barriers because of the lack of availability of workers to hire, and sometimes a lack of expertise. And so when you looked at service providers that people could hire in Australia, and again, this is where the majority of the research was done, it was really difficult to cover such large geographic area and space. And so just kind of accessing the availability of supports was a real challenge. I think, though, a lot of these barriers and facilitators that are kind of the other side of the coin, right? Having more choice, sometimes in rural communities, if there's a lot of social capital, for example, or real strengths in terms of the community, there might be real benefits in terms of the flexibility and choice that IF would offer, and with the uniqueness of say a more rural setting. But the challenges were really around the transportation, the availability of the expertise, and just the workers themselves. That came up just repeatedly in the research.
And I think that's more acute on the more therapeutic type supports. Respite, it's a little easier, but if there isn't anybody with that expertise within 100 miles of your community, you're going to have to go to them most likely.
Mm-hmm. And what about virtual communication tools, are those helpful in, maybe as a service delivery tool?
It didn't come up a lot in the literature, surprisingly, but I think our experiences during the last 3 years with COVID, we've, learned that virtual kinds of practices can be of support and use. It's also, not as ideal as having a face-to-face or in-person therapeutic experience. So those would be my initial thoughts, but there wasn't really much in the literature in terms of virtual support.
But I think there is a really quickly emerging literature on that. So the delivery of therapies generally, not necessarily related to IF. So it's a good point, and I think that's something that will open up that side. I think obviously there are some interventions that are just very difficult to do virtually.
Thank you. And then just maybe a couple of questions just to close us out before we move into discussion groups. There's been lots of conversation in the chat, so I just want to assure folks that have been contributing there that will be brought into this process and shared back with the ministry as part of the engagement. We did have a question about whether you could share a list of the literature review. Is that possible that you would be able to share that with our team, and we can make sure that it gets shared out through the website? So that's one question for the two of you.
Yeah. We do have an appendix to the review itself that has a list of all of the literature that was included with some of the outcomes and some of the points that were made within the research.
Perfect. Yeah, it sounds like.
I think we've undertaken this at the request of NCFD, so we're hopeful the report and everything will be made publicly available, but certainly we will be, from our end, we want all our things to be available to the community and families and people.
And I will mention also that in addition to the recording, your slides will be shared through the website as well, so folks can take a look back at that. And then the last question just on the research is how it is different from the research that the UBC Canadian Institute for Inclusion and Citizenship is doing with the Family Support Institute. Are you familiar with that?
Yes. So you can just say CIIC, it's much easier. Yeah, so the Family Support Institute has asked us to partner with them on their family engagement process. And so this project and presentation was specifically related to a literature review. So what does the research say about individualized funding, where the Family Support Institute project, the Family Voices project, is really wanting to engage with families around what they want to see in terms of the CYSN framework, what is important to them moving forward. And so we're going to conduct some individual interviews and focus groups for families who are interested in providing their feedback. So that's what that project is about.
Thanks for that. All right. Okay, so we're going to move ourselves now into our breakouts to continue the conversation. I'm going to share this discussion question with you here on the screen, and your facilitators will have this as well. So we're asking folks to kind of reflect on what was shared by Tim and Rachelle today. And based on that, like, what would be one or two considerations that stood out for you when thinking of a new system of services for children and youth with support needs? So you'll get a pop-up on your screen in just a moment to join your breakout. And we'll have about 25 minutes for that discussion. So we're going to come back to about 10 to, I don't know if I've got that timing right. We'll do a broadcast message. I'm sorry, I'm struggling with the math this morning. But we'll have a broadcast message partway through your session. and we'll come back and share a little bit of the conversation together as a group. So we'll see those pop-up windows coming, and have a great discussion, everyone. I think most of us are back. So what we'd like to do next is just share a little bit of what was discussed in the conversation in a couple of the breakout rooms. So I'm going to call on a couple of my colleagues just to give a couple of themes or summary. So I'm going to go to Rachelle first. I see you there, Rachelle, if you wouldn't mind sharing a little bit from your discussion group.
Yeah, so our group had a lot of great points around, concerns that they're facing as mostly service providers as well as families. And so some of the concerns include obviously service pricing going up, as well as a lack of service providers. So caseloads are going up, but there aren't a lot of services and staff available to support the caseload numbers. And the caps on, the pricing for funding sometimes don't match what exactly the therapists are charging. So there's another gap there, requiring parents to fill in when sometimes they're unable to. In regards to funding as well, obviously there is a need for more funding for folks with without diagnosis, with different diagnoses, and ideally seeing some of that individualized funding for people without only an autism diagnosis. So broader funding in general, and also more funding. And there was also a note about funding the system in addition. So not just funding, allowing families to have funding, but also the system so that there can be more staff to fill in those gaps. Another point was around communication and the navigation. It's hard for families as well as social workers. Part of that is around the transparent process around funding. There's a lot of parents and workers, or mostly parents, who are having a hard time expressing exactly what they need in order to get the supports that they need. They don't necessarily have the vocabulary already in their docket to self-advocate. And then the last point I wanted to make was that there was a point around the individualized funding model and how it was mentioned in the presentation, but it was just reinforced in our conversation that rurally, if you don't also have a system of providers in place, an individualized system might be difficult because of providers, choosing their own prices, as was mentioned, as well as leaving the area. Whereas if you do have, either a mixed model or at least some government-led model, that rurally there will be someone there available for you. Thanks.
Thank you, Rachelle. And Sarah.
Hi, everyone. Yeah, lots of really good and very thoughtful discussion. So I appreciate all those who shared in my room. I heard quite a few of the same points or issues that Rachelle has gone through. I'll just note some additional ones I heard. So I heard overall interest and support for an individualized funding model in terms of providing people and families with greater choice and autonomy. There are some important caveats, though. Of course, it's important to recognize that some individuals will require greater support, and that each family situation is unique. So a one-size-fits-all program and administration will not be effective and may actually exacerbate the existing challenges that people are facing. As Rachelle, I think, already mentioned, it's important to consider the administrative burden that families are experiencing, and that access to funding and services is great, but it's often just the first step in terms of actually being able to integrate that into one's daily life. From a service provider's point of view, we heard some significant barriers to service delivery. One of them was that there isn't currently specific funding available for things like translation services, as well as travel expenses being a pretty important barrier, specifically for those living in areas further away from larger centers with greater healthcare capacity and service offerings. What else? Also communication. So with a potential shift in the way that programs, where programs are housed and where funding is coming from, there will likely be gaps in people's understanding of how to access these services and funding. For example, currently there's a lack of certainty among educators as to where their programs will be housed in the future. And so it makes it really hard to expand and invest in these important programs for students and families. And maybe finally, one point I'll mention that I heard in my room is that some folks felt that the New Zealand model that the presenter shared would be a good one to draw from and to emulate in certain respects. One point that I thought was really important to share is the recognition of Indigenous held knowledge and care is really important to consider for Canadian context. And there are some parallels between New Zealand and Canada in terms of demographics. I think I'll end there.
Thanks, Sarah. Right. Just a few final notes before we adjourn this morning. There are additional sessions as part of the speaker series that are happening into December. We'll share the link with where you can register for those. We'll put that in the chat. And then also the second link is the place where you can go to sign up and subscribe for updates on this overall engagement and the work underway to reimagine the service delivery approach for children and youth with support needs. So in that second link, you can sign up for updates, as I mentioned. You will also find an online feedback form and directions if you would like to submit sort of a written submission as part of that. And that's open until December of next year. So wanted to highlight a few of the ways that people can continue to provide input as part of this work. There were a couple of questions about the overall timeline for the project that came up for this work that came up in a couple of our discussion groups. And so I'll just highlight again, the engagement is underway until December of next year. And signing up for updates is likely the best way to stay in touch with the next steps as that engagement concludes and that new service delivery approach is developed. With that, I want to thank everybody for the time this morning and the generous sharing of your insights and your perspectives. It helps make this process stronger and better. We do appreciate it. And we will adjourn for this morning. So thank you again.